Ezra Kane simply stood on the depot platform at Miles City, Montana, in October of 1887, gripping a photograph of a woman named Charlotte Dunmore that he had carried in his coat pocket since spring. He had written her for 8 months through the pages of a matrimonial paper out of San Francisco, and now the stagecoach from the railhead rolled in through the dust of the cattle town. But when the door swung open and a woman climbed down into the cold Montana light, Ezra felt his chest go tight and his breath catch hard. The face before him was not the face he had carried all along. Someone had sent him a lie, or a woman desperate enough to gamble everything she had left on a stranger's mercy. The photograph had traveled 2,000 miles to reach him, folded in brown paper and tied with string, and Ezra Kane had studied it so many nights by lamplight that he could have drawn every line of that face from memory alone. A woman with dark hair pinned high, a straight nose, a mouth caught somewhere between a smile and a question. Charlotte Dunmore, the letter accompanying it, had read, 26 years of age, of good character and sound health, seeking a husband of honest means in the Western Territories. He had answered that advertisement in the matrimonial news out of San Francisco on a night in February, when the wind off the Yellowstone had rattled his cabin windows so hard he thought the whole roof might tear loose. And he had done it mostly because the silence in that cabin had become a thing with weight to it, a thing that sat on his chest while he ate his supper alone, and pressed down harder while he lay in the bed he had built with his own hands for a wife who never came to fill the other half of it. Miles City in October of 1887 was not yet a decade old, but it had grown fast and rough along the banks of the Yellowstone River, fed by the cattle trade and the Northern Pacific line that had reached the town in 1881 and turned it overnight from a rumor of a settlement into a shipping point for half the beef in Montana Territory. Ezra had come out from Ohio in 1879, one of the thousands of young men who had heard that the grass out west grew belly-high to a horse, and that a man with grit and a little capital could build something real out of raw prairie. He had built it. 1,100 acres of grazing land along Sunday Creek, a herd that had grown from 40 head to nearly 600, a house of milled lumber instead of sod, and inside all of it, a hollowness that no amount of cattle or acreage had ever managed to fill. His wife Mary had died in the winter of 1884, taken by a fever that came on fast and left just as fast, and Ezra had buried her on a rise above the creek, where she had liked to watch the sun go down behind the Bull Mountains. He had told himself for 2 years that he did not need another wife, that a man could run a ranch alone well enough, that the ache in his chest would dull with time, the way every rancher told him it would. It had not dulled. If anything, the ache had sharpened with every empty chair at his table, every silent evening, every letter from his sister in Ohio, asking gently whether he meant to spend the rest of his life talking to cattle. So he had written the advertisement, and when the replies came in, he had chosen the one from Charlotte Dunmore because her letter had none of the desperation he sensed in some of the others, and none of the false cheer either. She wrote plainly. She wrote about wanting a life that meant something, about not being afraid of hard work or hard winters, about believing that two people could build something honest together, even if they had never stood in the same room. They had corresponded for 8 months. Ezra had told her about the ranch, about Mary, about the mountains that turned purple at dusk, and the way the northern light sometimes moved across the sky in green ribbons that made a man feel very small and very lucky at once. Charlotte had written back about her life in Ohio, close enough to his own home country that they had traded stories of towns and roads they both half knew, about her work as a seamstress after her father's death had left the family with debts, about a mother who worried, and a younger brother who had gone west himself 2 years before and never written since. She had sent the photograph in her 4th letter, apologizing that it was not a recent likeness, but the only one the studio in her town had ever taken of her. Ezra had looked at that photograph more times than he would have admitted to any living soul. He had fallen in love with a face on a square of paper and a voice that existed only in ink. And there were nights he lay awake wondering if that made him a fool, and other nights when it seemed like the only sensible thing a lonely man in an empty house could do. The letter that set the date had arrived in September. Charlotte would take the train as far as the line went, and the stagecoach the rest of the way, arriving at Miles City on the 14th of October, and Reverend Whitcomb at the Methodist Church had already agreed to perform the ceremony the following morning, provided both parties presented themselves sober and willing. Ezra had spent the 2 weeks before her arrival in a state he did not have a name for, somewhere between terror and the kind of hope that hurts worse than despair because it has so much further to fall. He had cleaned the house top to bottom. He had ridden into town and bought yard goods and a hat for her that the milliner assured him a lady would appreciate, though he had no earthly idea if that was true. He had stood in front of the small mirror in his bedroom more times than any grown man ought to, and wondered what Charlotte Dunmore would think when she looked at him the way he had looked at her photograph for 8 months, memorizing every detail, building a whole imagined life around a stranger's face. On the morning of the 14th, Ezra rode into Miles City before the sun had fully cleared the bluffs to the east, tied his horse outside the stage office, and stood on the depot platform with his hat in his hands, like a boy waiting to be called into the schoolmaster's office. The town was already loud with the business of a cattle depot, drovers and drummers, and freight wagons rattling over the rutted street. The smell of coal smoke and horse and the river all mixed together in the cold autumn air. Ezra had positioned himself where the stage always stopped, near the wooden awning of the McQueen House Hotel, and he had checked his coat pocket for the photograph so many times that the paper had gone soft and furred at the corners like a well-worn dollar bill. When the stagecoach finally came rattling down the last stretch of road from the railhead, dust boiling up behind its wheels, Ezra felt something in his chest lurch sideways, not quite fear and not quite joy, but some new thing assembled out of both. The coach rolled to a stop. The driver climbed down and began working the door latch, and for one suspended moment, the whole noisy town seemed to go quiet around Ezra Kane, the way a held breath goes quiet before it breaks. The door swung open. A woman's gloved hand appeared first, gripping the frame, and then she stepped down into the Montana light, and Ezra's mind went entirely, wordlessly blank. She was not the woman in the photograph. The woman who stood before him on that platform had hair the color of wheat straw, where the photograph had shown hair as dark as coffee. Her face was narrower, her eyes a pale gray-green instead of the warm brown he had studied for 8 months, and there was a thin white scar that ran from just below her left ear to the edge of her jaw, old enough to have healed flat and silver against her skin, but new enough to Ezra's eye that it seemed to announce itself, to demand an explanation he did not know how to ask for. She was perhaps 23 or 24, younger than the 26 Charlotte Dunmore's letters had claimed, and she stood very straight and very still, watching him with an expression that Ezra would spend the rest of his life trying to name, some mixture of fear and defiance, and a terrible naked hope that made his own chest ache in sympathy, even through his confusion. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, Miles City went on being loud and ordinary, drovers shouting at a balking team, a dog barking somewhere down toward the river, the stage driver hauling trunks down from the boot and calling out names that meant nothing to either of the two people standing frozen on the platform. Ezra opened his mouth twice before any words came out, and when they did, they were not the words he had rehearsed in his head for 2 weeks. "You are not her," he said. The woman's chin came up. There was steel in her. Ezra saw immediately. Steel underneath whatever fear was moving behind those pale eyes. "My name is Charlotte Dunmore," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her gloved hands, Ezra noticed, were pressed so tightly together that the knuckles had gone white. "I wrote every letter I sent you myself. Every word in them was true." "Then whose face is this?" Ezra said, and pulled the photograph from his coat pocket. holding it out between them like evidence in a trial neither of them had asked to stand before. The woman looked at the photograph for a long moment, and something moved across her face that Ezra could not yet read, though later, much later, he would understand it as grief wearing the mask of composure. "That is my sister," she said finally. "That is Charlotte." That was Charlotte. The word was slid into the past tense so quietly that Ezra almost missed it, and when its meaning caught up with him a beat later, the ground under the whole encounter seemed to shift. "Was," Ezra repeated. The woman who was not the woman in the photograph closed her eyes for just a moment. The first crack Ezra had seen in that carefully held composure, and when she opened them again, there were tears standing in them that she did not let fall. "My sister Charlotte answered your advertisement," she said. "She wrote you every letter with her own hand, and every word she wrote you was the truth about her own heart, her own hopes, her own life. She sent you her own photograph because it was the only one we had. She meant to come here and marry you, Mr. Kane, and she meant every word she ever put on paper to you. But in August she took a fever, the same kind of fever that has been moving through half of Ohio this year, and within 9 days she was gone. I buried my sister on the 11th of August in the same plot as our father, and I have been trying since then to decide what a person is supposed to do with a life that was already promised, away to a stranger 2,000 miles from home." Ezra stood on that platform with the photograph still held out between them, and he felt the entire careful architecture of the last 8 months come apart in his hands, like a house built of dry kindling. He had fallen in love, or something close enough to love, that the difference hardly mattered, with a woman who no longer existed, whose letters had been true, and whose heart had been real, and whose face he would now never see, except on a square of paper that had outlived her. And standing in her place was a stranger he had never corresponded with, never promised anything to, a woman with a scarred jaw and pale eyes, and a grief so raw it seemed to radiate off her skin like heat off summer rock. "Why did you come?" Ezra asked, and it was not an accusation, though it might have sounded like one. "Why would you travel 2,000 miles to stand in your dead sister's place in front of a man who never asked for you?" The woman's composure cracked further, though her voice held. "Because someone had to write and tell you," she said. "Because a letter felt like a coward's way to deliver such news. And because our mother is a widow with no income and a debt on the house that my sister's marriage was meant to help ease. And because I did not know, Mr. Kane, whether you were a decent man or a cruel one, and I was not willing to trust my mother's welfare to a letter that a decent man might read with sympathy and a cruel one might simply ignore. I came to tell you myself. I came to see your face when you learned the truth, so that I would know which kind of man you were before I turned around and went home again." Somewhere behind them, the stage driver was calling out that the coach would be departing again within the hour for anyone continuing on toward Junction City, and the ordinary business of the Frontier Depot went on churning around the two of them, indifferent to the small catastrophe unfolding in its midst. Ezra looked at this stranger, who had crossed half a continent to deliver grief she had not caused and could not undo, who stood on a public platform in a town full of strangers, and let a man she had never met see her cry rather than send the news by post, and spare herself the humiliation of his reaction. And something in his chest that had nothing to do with the photograph or the letters or 8 months of careful, hopeful correspondence began, very quietly, to shift. "What is your name?" he asked her. "Your own name, not your sister's." The woman studied him for a long moment, as though deciding whether the question itself was a kindness or another kind of trap, and then something in her shoulders eased, just slightly, the way a person's shoulders ease when a burden they have been bracing to carry alone is suddenly, unexpectedly, shared. "Adeline," she said. "Adeline Dunmore. I am 4 years younger than Charlotte was, and I have never in my life stood on a train platform in a territory I could not have found on a map 2 months ago. And I am asking you, Mr. Kane, not for a marriage that was never promised to me, but simply for a moment to explain myself before you decide what to do with a stranger who has arrived on your doorstep, bearing nothing but bad news and an empty promise." Ezra folded the photograph carefully and returned it to his coat pocket, though something in the gesture felt different now, less like a talisman and more like a keepsake for grief that was not entirely his own to carry. And he found himself doing something that surprised him even as he did it. He held out his arm, the way a gentleman might to escort a lady from a train platform into a town she had never seen, and he said the only thing that felt true in that moment, the only thing that felt like it, belonged to him and not to 8 months of letters written to a woman who could no longer answer them. "Come have supper at the McQueen house, Miss Dunmore," he said. "You have traveled a very long way, and whatever else is true, you should not have to stand on this platform and explain yourself to the whole town at once. We can talk inside, where it is warm, and you can tell me the rest of it in your own time." Adeline Dunmore looked at his offered arm for a moment that stretched almost unbearably long, and Ezra could see her weighing something behind those pale, gray-green eyes, some calculation about trust and risk, and the 2,000 miles she had already traveled on nothing but her own resolve. Then, slowly, she set her gloved hand on his forearm, and the two of them walked together off the platform and into the noise and dust of Miles City. Two strangers bound together by a photograph that belonged to neither of them, and a grief that belonged only to her. Though Ezra was already beginning to suspect, with a mixture of alarm and something dangerously close to relief, that it would not stay only hers for very much longer. Neither of them noticed the man watching from the corner by the freight office, a lean figure in a dust-colored coat who had ridden in on the same stage and had said not one word to either of them during the whole long journey from the railhead, but who watched Adeline Dunmore walk away on Ezra Kane's arm with an expression that had nothing warm in it at all, and who turned, once they had gone, and asked the stage agent in a low voice exactly which ranch belonged to a man named Ezra Kane. The dining room at the McQueen house smelled of wood smoke and roasted beef and the particular mustiness of a hotel that had been built in a hurry to serve a town growing faster than its lumber could season. Ezra found them a table near the window, away from the drovers and cattle buyers crowding the bar at the far end, and for a long moment after they sat, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched thin between two people who had absolutely nothing and absolutely everything to say to one another. A girl came to take their order, and Ezra asked for coffee and whatever the kitchen had ready, and when she had gone again, he found Adeline Dunmore watching him with those pale gray-green eyes, waiting, he understood, to see what kind of man he would turn out to be, now that the shock of the platform had passed, and there was nothing left between them but plain conversation. "You did not have to bring me here," she said finally. "You could have put me back on the eastbound stage and been done with it. Most men would have. Most men did not spend 8 months writing to a woman, only to learn she had been gone from this world since August." Ezra said, "I am not sure what most men would do in my position, Miss Dunmore, because I do not know many men who have found themselves in it." A small, unwilling smile touched the corner of her mouth. There and gone so quickly, Ezra almost doubted he had seen it. "You have a strange way of being kind," she said. "I have had 4 years of practice being alone," Ezra said. "It teaches a man to notice kindness when it is offered him, even when it comes wrapped in strange circumstances." The coffee arrived, and Adeline wrapped both gloved hands around the cup, as though the warmth of it were the first comfort she had allowed herself in weeks. Ezra watched her, and found himself doing the thing he had done for 8 months with her sister's photograph, searching a face for the truth of the person behind it, except this time the face was living and breathing across a table from him, instead of frozen in silver and paper, and there was something in that difference that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. "You did not travel 2,000 miles only to deliver news of a death, A letter could have done that, cruel as it might have felt to send. You said as much yourself. So tell me why a woman travels alone across half a continent into a territory she cannot find on a map, when a letter would have served the purpose you claim you came for. Adeline was quiet for a long moment, turning the coffee cup slowly on its saucer, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of the careful steadiness she had held since the platform. My father died 3 years ago, she said, and left my mother with a debt on the house that neither of us fully understood until the collector came to explain it plainly. The note was held by a man in our town named Thaddeus Voss, a merchant with more money than conscience, who had loaned my father a sum against the house some years before without my mother's full knowledge of the terms. When my father died, Voss came to call, and he did not come only to collect. He came because he had decided, in the particular way of men who believe money entitles them to whatever they desire, that he would forgive the debt entirely in exchange for a marriage. Not to my mother, who he considered too old for his purposes, and not to Charlotte, who had already taken up letter writing with a rancher in Montana Territory and made her intentions plain. He came for me. Ezra felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the October chill outside the window. And your mother agreed to this, he said. My mother is a widow, with no income, and a house she cannot keep without either Voss's mercy or Charlotte's marriage, Adeline said. She did not agree easily, and she wept for 3 nights before she came to me and asked whether I could find it in myself to accept a man I had never once looked at without a shiver of dread. And then Charlotte took the fever, and everything that had seemed merely difficult became impossible all at once. Voss came again within a week of my sister's burial, before the ground on her grave had even properly settled, and told my mother that since Charlotte's engagement to a stranger in Montana was now void, there was no longer any obstacle to his arrangement with me. He set a date. He had already spoken to the minister. My mother, God forgive her, for I do believe she loved us both and simply saw no other road out of ruin, told me that I ought to consider myself fortunate, that a man of his means would still want a Dunmore daughter after all of our family's troubles. The frontier of the 1880s ran on hard economics that made women's positions more precarious than sentiment liked to admit, and Ezra, who had watched more than one widow in Miles City forced into unhappy arrangements by exactly this kind of financial vice, understood the shape of what Adeline was describing even before she finished it. Under the laws of most states in that era, a widow's claim to her own household could be swallowed whole by a note her husband had signed, and she had never seen, and a young woman with no income of her own and no male relative to intervene had precious few doors open to her, besides the one a man like Voss was pleased to hold ajar, expecting gratitude for the privilege of walking through it. So you came here instead, Ezra said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces. You did not simply come to deliver news of Charlotte's death. You came because this stagecoach, this ticket already purchased in your sister's name, was the one door out of that house that Thaddeus Voss did not think to guard. Adeline's eyes came up to meet his, and there was something fierce in them now beneath the grief, something that reminded Ezra of the way a cornered animal will sometimes turn and fight rather than run. Not out of courage exactly, but out of the simple absence of any other choice. I took the ticket my sister had already paid for, she said. I took the small trunk of belongings she had already packed. I told my mother I was going west to deliver the news in person because it seemed the honorable thing to do, and she believed me. Or perhaps she only wanted to believe me, because the alternative was watching me marry Thaddeus Voss within the month, and neither of us could bear to look at that alternative directly. I did not plan beyond arriving at this platform and telling you the truth. I did not let myself imagine what would happen after that, because I was afraid that if I imagined failure, I would lose whatever courage had gotten me onto that train in the first place. Outside the window, the light was beginning to slant gold and low across Main Street. the particular color of a Montana Territory afternoon in October, when the cottonwoods along the Yellowstone had already turned, and the air carried the first hard edge of the winter that would arrive within weeks. Ezra sat with the weight of what she had told him settling into his chest alongside the grief he still carried for a woman he had never met in the flesh, and he found that the two feelings did not compete with one another the way he might have expected. They sat together, oddly companionable, grief for Charlotte Dunmore, and something else entirely, something new and unnamed, for the sister who had crossed a continent rather than marry a man who frightened her. "What will you do now?" he asked. "If I put you back on that stage, where would you go? Not back to Ohio, surely?" "I do not know," Adeline admitted, and for the first time since the platform, her voice cracked slightly around the edges. "I have perhaps $40 to my name and a trunk of belongings meant for a wedding that will never take place. I had thought, foolishly perhaps, that once I had told you the truth, I might find some kind of work in a town like this. A seamstress's position, perhaps, or work in a shop, enough to send a little money home to my mother, so that Voss's patience does not run out entirely before I find some better solution. I had not thought much further than that. I am not certain there was much further to think." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, turning his own coffee cup the way she had turned hers, and when he spoke again, it was slowly, the words arriving one careful piece at a time, the way a man tests ice before he trusts his full weight to it. "I wrote to your sister for 8 months because I was lonely, in a way I had stopped admitting, even to myself," he said. "I built a life out here that other men would call a success, cattle and land, and a house better than most in the territory, and none of it filled the particular emptiness that comes from eating supper alone every night of your life. I do not know you, Miss Dunmore. I know your sister's handwriting and your sister's account of her days, and your sister's face, which I now understand I will never see, except in a photograph. But I have spent one afternoon in your company, and in that afternoon, you have shown me more courage than I have seen in most men I have known my whole life. I am not offering you marriage. I would not insult either of us by pretending a single supper is grounds for that. But I am offering you a position, if you will have it, keeping house and helping with the accounts on my ranch through the winter, honest wages and an honest roof, until you have had time to decide what you want your life to become. Reverend Whitcomb's wife takes in boarders at the parsonage and would stand as chaperone to the arrangement if propriety concerns you, which I expect it should." Adeline stared at him across the table for a long moment, and Ezra watched something move behind her eyes that he could not entirely name. Gratitude tangled up with suspicion, tangled up with something that might, given time and evidence of good faith, have grown into trust. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You owe me nothing. I arrived bearing grief you did not ask for, and a story that must sound, to a reasonable man, entirely too convenient to be believed without question. Because 8 months of letters taught me that the Dunmore family writes with more honesty than most people manage in a lifetime of conversation," Ezra said. "And because I have buried one person I loved on a rise above Sunday Creek, and I find I have no patience left for turning away someone in genuine need, simply because her arrival did not match the shape I had imagined for it. It was in that moment, with the gold light sliding low across the dining room floor and the ordinary clatter of supper going on around them, that the door of the McQueen house opened, and the lean man in the dust-colored coat stepped inside, removed his hat with unhurried deliberation, and let his gaze move across the room until it settled, without any pretense of subtlety, on the table where Ezra Kane and Adeline Dunmore sat, with their heads bent close together over coffee gone cold. Adeline went very still. Ezra felt the change in her before he understood its cause, the way her hands stopped their restless turning of the cup and her spine straightened by some fraction of an inch, the posture of a person bracing without wanting to appear to brace. "You know that man," Ezra said quietly. "I have never seen him in my life," Adeline said. and her voice had gone thin and careful in a way that told Ezra she was telling the truth about the particular fact, even as something else entirely was clearly wrong. But I know the code. Thaddeus Voss has a man who does his errands. When the errand requires more travel or more roughness than Voss cares to undertake himself, he is called Boone. I have never met him face to face, but my mother described him once, after he came to the house to press the terms of Voss's arrangement, and she said she had never in her life felt so afraid of a man who had done nothing but stand quietly in her parlor and wait. The man called Boone did not approach their table. He crossed instead to the hotel's front desk, exchanged a few unhurried words with the clerk, and then took a seat near the door with the particular patience of a man who has done this kind of waiting before and does not mind doing it again. A patience that Ezra found more unsettling than any direct confrontation could have been. Outside the window, the last of the gold light was fading into the blue dusk that came early to Montana territory in October, and somewhere down toward the stockyards, a train whistle sounded long and low across the darkening prairie, and Ezra Kane understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives in a single unwelcome instant, that whatever this evening had begun between himself and Adeline Dunmore, it was no longer a private matter between two strangers working out an honest arrangement over supper. It had an audience now, one that had followed her 2,000 miles across a continent, and Ezra did not yet know what that audience intended to do about what it had found. Boone did not approach them that evening at all. He simply waited near the door of the McQueen house until Ezra rose and paid the bill and walked Adeline out into the cold blue dusk. And then he rose himself, unhurried, and followed them at a distance of perhaps 30 paces down the boardwalk, close enough to be seen and far enough to claim, if challenged, that he was merely a stranger walking in the same direction. Ezra was aware of him the whole way to the parsonage, a shadow at the edge of vision that never quite closed the distance and never quite fell away, and he found himself standing a little straighter, a little more deliberately between Adeline and the street, the way a man does when he has decided, without entirely admitting it to himself yet, that he has taken on a responsibility he did not have that morning. Reverend Whitcomb and his wife received them at the parsonage door with the particular unflappable calm of people who had spent a decade on the frontier, absorbing whatever unlikely circumstances the territory saw fit to deliver to their doorstep. And when Ezra explained, as plainly as he could manage, that the woman standing beside him was not the bride he had expected, but her younger sister, arrived with grief instead of a wedding, Mrs. Whitcomb simply nodded, as though this were roughly the third such surprise she had absorbed that month, and showed Adeline to a room at the back of the house, without further comment, beyond a promise of hot water and a decent supper, whatever the hotel had or had not already provided. It was only once Adeline had gone inside that Ezra allowed himself to turn and look back down the darkening street. And there, beneath the awning of the dry goods store across the way, Boone stood with his hat pulled low and his hands loose at his sides, watching the parsonage with the patience of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be, and no particular hurry about being wherever that was. Ezra crossed the street toward him before he had entirely decided to do it. Some old instinct from 4 years of protecting a herd from wolves and rustlers alike, carrying him forward faster than caution might otherwise have allowed. "You have been following us since the hotel," Ezra said. "I would like to know why, and I would like to know it plainly, man to man, rather than have you skulk in doorways all evening like you are ashamed of your own business." Boone regarded him for a long moment, with pale, unhurried eyes, the kind of eyes Ezra had seen before on men who made their living doing the unpleasant errands that other men preferred not to dirty their own hands with. "My business is with the young lady," he said finally, his voice flat and without particular malice, which somehow made it worse. "Mr. Voss sent me west when he learned she had taken her sister's ticket, instead of waiting for the family to settle matters properly at home. He would like her returned to Ohio, where an arrangement already exists that she has no legal standing to simply abandon. There is no arrangement that binds a grown woman against her will in this territory or any other, Ezra said, and he was somewhat surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, given how quickly his temper had risen. Whatever debt her father incurred, whatever promise her mother may have made under duress, none of it obligates Miss Dunmore to marry a man she has never chosen for herself. Boone's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. That is a fine sentiment for a rancher with 600 head of cattle and clear title to his land, he said. It carries less weight for a widow in Ohio with a mortgage note coming due, and a daughter 2,000 miles away, who is the only leverage she has left to keep her roof over her head through the winter. I am not here to argue points of law with you, Mr. Kane. I am here to see the young lady returned, or failing that, to see that Mr. Voss's interests are otherwise satisfied. I expect we will speak again before this business is concluded. He touched the brim of his hat with a courtesy that felt more like mockery than manners, and then he turned and walked off into the dark toward the rougher end of town, where the saloon stayed lit past midnight, leaving Ezra standing alone in the cold with a knot of anger and worry tightening in his chest that had not been there that morning, when his only concern had been whether a woman he had never met would find his ranch, and his heart adequate to the promises he had made her in 8 months of letters. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither Ezra nor Adeline could have predicted on that first strange afternoon at the depot. She moved out to the ranch within the week, installed in the small room that had once belonged to Ezra's sister during a visit years before, and Mrs. Whitcomb rode out twice, weekly ostensibly to check on the propriety of the arrangement, but in practice, Ezra suspected, simply because she had taken a liking to Adeline and welcomed any excuse for the company. Adeline proved herself capable in ways that surprised even her, keeping the ranch accounts with a precision that put Ezra's own scratched ledger to shame, mending harness and clothing with a seamstress's careful hand, and gradually, over the slow accumulation of ordinary days, filling the silence of that house in a way Ezra had not experienced since Mary's death. The Montana territory of that autumn was hurrying toward winter with the particular urgency the northern range always showed once the first hard frosts arrived, and Ezra spent long days finishing the fall roundup, moving cattle down from the higher grazing along Sunday Creek before the first serious snow closed the passes, while Adeline managed the house and, more than once, rode out herself to help drive strays back toward the home pasture, sitting a horse with a competence that told Ezra she had learned to ride somewhere in Ohio, despite whatever genteel seamstress's life her letters had once described. They did not speak of marriage. They did not speak, in fact, of very much beyond the ordinary business of the ranch and the careful growing comfort of two people learning each other's habits, the way Adeline hummed old hymns without noticing while she worked, the way Ezra fell silent and thoughtful every evening around the hour, when the light turned the particular gold that reminded him of Mary, a silence Adeline had learned to simply sit beside rather than interrupt. But something was building beneath the surface of those ordinary days, something neither of them named aloud, though both of them felt it, in the way Ezra found himself watching for Adeline's laugh across the supper table, in the way Adeline had begun, without quite noticing she was doing it, to set 2 cups out for coffee each morning before Ezra had even come down from dressing, an assumption of shared routine that neither of them commented on, but both of them recognized as something new, growing quietly in the space where grief and obligation had first brought them together. It was not the love Ezra had imagined building slowly, through 8 months of letters with a woman who had died before he ever met her. It was something else entirely, something that had arrived sideways and unbidden, the way a storm arrives on the northern range, with no warning beyond a change in the color of the sky. And Ezra found himself, some 3 weeks into Adeline's residence at the ranch, standing at the corral fence one evening, watching her walk back from the hen house with the particular ease she had developed in her stride since arriving, and understanding with sudden and unwelcome clarity that he had fallen in love with the sister After all, not the photograph, not the letters, but the living, breathing, courageous woman who had crossed 2,000 miles rather than accept a life chosen for her by other people's debts. He said nothing of it. Neither, he suspected, did she, though there were moments, small and easily explained away, when he caught her watching him with an expression that mirrored whatever she must have seen on his own face when he did not think to guard it. Neither of them spoke of Boone either, though Ezra had made careful inquiry around town and learned that the man had taken a room at the International Hotel down near the stockyards and showed no sign of departing. A quiet, patient presence at the edge of Miles City that everyone in town seemed to have noticed and no one quite knew what to make of, since he had done nothing overtly threatening beyond simply being there, watching, waiting. The way a hawk waits above a field, it is already decided holds something worth the patience. The letter came in the second week of November, delivered by the same stage that had brought Adeline west. Addressed in a hand, Adeline recognized the instant she saw it lying on the hall table, and Ezra watched the color drain from her face as she broke the seal and read it, standing in the front room with the November wind rattling the window panes behind her. "It is from my mother," she said finally, her voice gone thin and strange. "Voss has grown impatient with waiting for word of my return. He has told her that, if I am not back in Ohio by the first week of December, he will call the note on the house immediately, in full, with no further mercy or delay, and she and my younger brothers will lose the only home they have ever known before the first snow falls on our own street. She begs me to come home, Ezra, not because she wants me to suffer whatever life Voss intends for me, but because she cannot see any other way to keep a roof over 3 children's heads through the winter, and she is asking me, in the gentlest words a desperate mother can find, to do the one thing that might save them all." Ezra took the letter from her trembling hands and read it himself, and found in it exactly the anguish Adeline had described, a mother's love and a mother's terror tangled together in careful, apologetic handwriting that made no demand and offered no absolution, only the plain and devastating fact of what would happen if her daughter didn't return. He set the letter down on the hall table and looked at Adeline standing there in the gray November light, with her hand still shaking and her eyes bright with tears she was fighting not to shed. And he understood that whatever had grown quietly between them these past 3 weeks was about to be tested in a way neither of them had prepared for, that the ordinary rhythm of ranch life and shared silences and unspoken glances across the supper table was about to collide, without warning and without mercy, with the same hard economics that had sent her running west in the first place, and Ezra Kane found himself facing a question he had not expected to face so soon, a question with no comfortable answer waiting anywhere within reach. "What will you do?" he asked her quietly, though some part of him already dreaded whatever answer she might give, and some other part of him, newer and less guarded, was already forming an answer of his own, one he had not yet found the courage to speak aloud. Adeline looked up at him, and in her pale gray-green eyes, Ezra saw the same fierce, cornered courage he had first glimpsed on the depot platform 6 weeks before, courage that had carried her 2,000 miles once already, and now stood ready, he understood with a sinking certainty, to carry her straight back into the very arrangement she had fled. "I do not know," she whispered, "but I know I cannot let my mother lose everything because of a debt that was never mine to owe, and I know that whatever I decide, I have perhaps 3 weeks to decide it in, before the first stage leaves for the railhead that would carry me home in time to save her." Ezra did not sleep that night. He lay in the dark, listening to the wind moving over the roof shingles, the way it always did before a hard freeze, and he turned Adeline's words over and over in his mind, the fierce, cornered courage in her voice when she had said she could not let her mother lose everything. And somewhere in the small hours before dawn, he arrived at a decision that felt, once he had reached it, so obvious that he wondered why it had taken him half the night to find it. He rode into Miles City before first light, before even the earliest freight wagons had begun rattling down Main Street, and he waited outside the door of the Stockman's Bank until the cashier arrived to open it. A man named Harlan Pruitt, who had handled Ezra's accounts since he first arrived in the territory, and who listened, with steadily rising eyebrows, to what Ezra proposed to do with a substantial portion of the money he had saved against a hard winter or a bad year with the herd. "I want to send a bank draft to Ohio," Ezra said, "and I want it sent by telegraph today if the wire will carry it, to settle a note held by a merchant named Thaddeus Voss against a house belonging to a widow named Dunmore. I want the note paid in full, with proof of payment wired back to me and to the widow both, so that there can be no question raised later about whether the debt has truly been satisfied." Pruitt studied him for a long moment, the particular look of a banker calculating whether a customer had lost his good sense overnight. And then, because he had known Ezra Kane for 8 years and trusted his judgment even when it surprised him, he simply nodded and began drawing up the necessary papers. "That is the better part of what you have saved these 4 years, he said quietly, not as an objection, but as a plain statement of fact that Ezra ought to be permitted to weigh for himself. "It is the best use I have found for it yet," Ezra said, and meant it entirely. The transaction took the better part of the morning. Wires sent and confirmations awaited. The particular slow bureaucracy of frontier banking stretched thin across 2,000 miles of telegraph line, and Ezra spent the waiting hours in a state of restless purpose he had not felt since he first broke ground on his own homestead 8 years before. He did not go back to the ranch to tell Adeline what he had done. He wanted, he realized, as the morning wore on, to be entirely certain the debt was settled before he said a single word to her about it, so that whatever she decided afterward would be a decision made freely, unburdened by gratitude or obligation toward a man who had simply solved her family's crisis for her. It was nearly noon when the confirmation wire arrived, stamped and certified, proof that the note against the Dunmore house in Ohio had been paid in full and the mortgage released, with a duplicate wire already sent onward to the widow herself, so that she would know the truth of her situation before any further pressure from Thaddeus Voss could reach her. Ezra folded the confirmation into his coat pocket, in the same place where he had once carried a photograph of a woman he had never met, and rode for town's edge to find Boone, because he understood that the man deserved to hear directly and plainly that his employer's leverage in this matter no longer existed. He found Boone exactly where he expected, taking his midday meal alone at a corner table in the International Hotel's small dining room, and Ezra crossed the room without hesitation and set the confirmation wire down on the table in front of him. "The debt is paid," Ezra said. "Every dollar, with interest, confirmed by wire to both the bank in Ohio and to Mrs. Dunmore herself. Whatever claim Mr. Voss believed he held over that family's welfare is finished as of this morning. You may wire him the news yourself, or I will do it for you. But either way, there is nothing left here for you to wait for." Boone read the confirmation slowly, and something moved behind his pale eyes that Ezra could not entirely name. Something that might, in a different man, have been relief at the prospect of an unpleasant errand finally concluded. He folded the paper and slid it back across the table. "You understand this does not undo whatever arrangement Voss believes still stands regarding the young lady herself," he said. "A debt is one thing. A man's pride when he has been made a fool of in his own town is another matter entirely. And Voss is not a man who forgives being made a fool of gracefully. Then he can bring his grievance to me directly," Ezra said, "and I will answer it as a man answers such things. But he will not use a widow's roof or a young woman's fear to do his arguing for him any longer." Boone studied Ezra for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, something like respect flickered across his weathered face. "I have done a great many errands for men like Thaddeus Voss over the years," he said, "and I will tell you plainly, Mr. Kane, that this is the first time in longer than I care to admit that I have been glad to see one of them fail." He rose, left coins on the table for his meal, and touched his hat brim in the same mocking courtesy he had shown before, though this time it seemed to Ezra to carry something closer to genuine acknowledgement. I will wire Voss this afternoon and take the evening stage east. Whatever quarrel remains between you and him now, it is no longer any business of mine. Ezra rode back to the ranch through the cold, bright afternoon with the confirmation wire still folded in his pocket, and he found Adeline in the kitchen, flour to her elbows from an afternoon of baking that he suspected had been more about occupying restless, frightened hands than any real need for bread. And when he told her what he had done, plainly and without embellishment, watching her face for whatever reaction might come, he saw something break open in her expression that was neither quite joy nor quite disbelief, but some combination of both so raw that she had to set down the mixing bowl before her hands began to shake too badly to hold it. "You paid the entire debt," she said, when she had found her voice again, "without asking me, without telling me you meant to do it. I did not want you deciding anything out of gratitude toward me," Ezra said. "I wanted your mother safe and your family free of Voss's grip, regardless of whatever else happened between the two of us, because that seemed to me the only decent thing to do once I understood the shape of what you were carrying. What you decide now, about staying or going, about anything at all, I wanted that decision to belong entirely to you, made freely, with nothing owed to anyone." Adeline was quiet for a long moment, standing in the winter light of that kitchen, with flour on her hands and tears standing unshed in her pale gray-green eyes. And when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the careful composure she had carried since the depot platform 6 weeks before. It had, instead, something Ezra had not yet heard from her, something unguarded and entirely her own. "I came to this territory to deliver grief I did not want to carry," she said, "and to escape a life I was terrified of living. And I told myself the whole way here that I would ask for nothing, that I would take only what honest work could earn me, and be grateful for whatever small mercies a stranger chose to extend. I did not let myself imagine anything beyond that, because I was afraid of wanting something I had no right to want. But these past weeks, Ezra, working beside you, watching you build a life out of raw prairie and stubbornness, and an amount of quiet decency I have rarely encountered in any man, I have found myself wanting something I never once let myself imagine on that stagecoach ride west. I have found myself falling in love with a man I met by accident, in circumstances neither of us chose, in a story that began with my sister's photograph, and a lie neither of us told, but both of us had to live through anyway." Ezra crossed the kitchen and took her flour-dusted hands in his own, and found that his voice, when it came, was not entirely steady either. "I wrote to Charlotte Dunmore for 8 months and fell in love, I thought, with a woman I had never met," he said. "But I understand now that what I felt for those letters was hope, and hope is a fine thing, but it is not the same as this, not the same as watching a woman ride out into a Montana winter to help drive strays home, not the same as 3 weeks of shared silences across a supper table, not the same as standing in a kitchen with flour on her hands and understanding all at once and without any doubt left in me that I do not want to spend one more evening of my life eating supper alone. I am not asking you this because a debt is settled, or because Boone has gone east, or because any part of this began as a plan either of us made on purpose. I am asking you because somewhere in these 6 strange weeks, without either of us choosing it, I have fallen in love with you, Adeline Dunmore. Not your sister, not the woman in the photograph, but you, exactly as you are. And I would like, if you will have me, to spend the rest of my life proving that this love was worth the strange and unexpected road that brought it to my door." Adeline Dunmore stood in that kitchen, with the last of the November light falling gold across the floorboards, the same color, Ezra realized distantly, that had fallen across the dining room table at the McQueen house the evening they first sat down together as strangers, and she looked up at him with an expression that held every ounce of the fierce, cornered courage he had first seen on the depot platform, transformed now into something softer and infinitely more certain. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Ezra Kane, I will marry you, not out of gratitude, and not out of desperation, and not because any debt required it of me, but because somewhere between a photograph that was never truly mine and a life I never expected to want, I have found exactly the thing I came west, hoping, without quite admitting it to myself, that I might someday find." Reverend Whitcomb performed the ceremony on the second Sunday of December in a small ranch house parlor decorated with pine boughs and the particular fierce brightness of a Montana territory, winter sun reflecting off 6 inches of fresh snow, with Mrs. Whitcomb standing as witness, and a small gathering of neighboring ranch families filling out the room with the warm, unpretentious hospitality that frontier communities extended to one another in celebration as readily as they extended it in hardship. Adeline wore a dress she had made herself from yard goods Ezra had bought in October, for a bride he had expected to be someone else entirely, altered now to fit the woman who actually stood beside him. And when Reverend Whitcomb pronounced them husband and wife, Ezra Kane understood that he had built, without ever intending to, exactly the life he had been reaching for in every lonely letter he had written since that February night when the wind off the Yellowstone had rattled his windows and driven him, finally, to admit that a man cannot build a whole life out of cattle and land alone. Word came in the spring that Thaddeus Voss had left Ohio quietly, his reputation in that small town sufficiently damaged by the story of a debt paid off by a stranger and a bride who had refused him twice over, that he found it easier to relocate his business elsewhere than to remain among neighbors who had heard the whole of it. Adeline's mother wrote often that first year, letters full of relief and gratitude, and gradually, the ordinary small news of a widow rebuilding a settled life, and in the second summer of their marriage, she made the long journey west herself to see her daughter's new home, to stand at the grave of the daughter she had lost, and to meet, at long last, the son-in-law whose 8 months of letters to a woman who never lived to answer them had somehow, through grief and courage and a photograph that told only half a truth, led her surviving daughter to exactly the life she deserved. This is a story the historical record of Montana Territory remembers only in fragments, in the scattered letters and diaries and newspaper notices that frontier families left behind for those who came looking for them later, in the marriage records of Custer County and the burial registers where sisters and strangers alike found their names written into the permanent history of a country still being built, one hard winter and one unexpected kindness at a time. It is a story about a photograph that was never quite the truth, and a woman who was so much more than any single picture could have shown, about a debt that money could settle and a love that money never could have bought, about the particular, unrepeatable way that 2 strangers, brought together by a lie neither of them told, found in each other something entirely real. If this story moved you the way it moved everyone who has ever heard the true history of the frontier's unexpected marriages, take a moment now to follow this channel, so that you never miss the next true story the Old West still has waiting to be told. Leave a like if you believe, as Ezra and Adeline came to believe, that love can arrive from the most unexpected direction and still be the truest thing a person ever finds. And leave a comment below telling us what you would have done standing on that depot platform in October of 1887 if the woman who stepped down from the stage was not the woman in the photograph at all. Thank you for spending this time in the Old West with us, and we will see you in the next story.